I'm John Eatwell, and I'm chairing this discussion this evening. Now, the topic of the debate this evening is devaluation of sterling. Could this revive growth of the British economy? And this is a topic which is usually left to economists like me, but this evening we've got two distinguished businessmen who have agreed to debate this particular issue. John Mills, who's going to kick off in a moment and who is standing here to my right, and Andrew Cook, who's over there, who is going to speak second. So these are our two protagonists this evening. You will have all seen short biographies of them, so I'm not going to elaborate on that. And so in policy debates over the UK economy and the European economy over the last several years, one variable that dominated British discussions in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s has been notable by its absence. That is variations of the exchange rate. And so this debate is bringing the exchange rate, if you like, back into the debate about the future of the UK economy. Now, if we look back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, exchange rate policy was used aggressively by some successful economies. The Italian economy used to devalue the lira while still running a surplus on their balance of payments, and managed with a relatively high inflation and continuously devaluing exchange rate to move from being a very backward economy at the end of the Second World War into a significant industrial power, at least the north of Italy, today. The Germans also pursued a strategy of keeping their exchange rate low, which they still do, actually. The strategy today is to join up with a number of weaker economies in a single currency zone, and therefore to keep your currency extremely low. Imagine where the Deutschmark would be if they were a separate currency. In the UK, on the other hand, the exchange rate has never been an active element of policy, but has actually been associated with policy failure. The devaluations in 1948 and then again in 1967 were both the failure of a result of a failure of financial policy and a subsequent crisis. The issues before us this evening are, first of all, can devaluation revive the British economy? But there's a prior question which both speakers may address, which is it possible to devalue in the financial environment, the open financial markets we have today? But that's questions for them. So for the first, 15 minutes, I hand over to John Mills for the proposition. John.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. Okay. The British economy at the moment has got a little bit of an upturn. Doing better than most of the other economies in the West, which isn't saying very much, but it's better than nothing. I don't think that's going to last. I think that if we're not very careful, we're going to be in for potentially a whole decade of stagnation. And I think there are at least 5 things wrong with the British economy which has caused us to be in that position. The first is that our rate of investment is unbelievably low compared to the world average. The world average proportion of GDP that's invested is 24%. In China, the figure is 46%. In the UK, it's 14%. Now, 11.5% of GDP goes in depreciation, which leaves 2.5% over. 2.5% barely covers the additional expenditure you need just to hold the position, bearing in mind our population is increasing at 400,000 people per annum. So the net result of all this is that we have no net investment per head of the population at all. And that, I think, very largely accounts for the fact that we've got no productivity increases. The second problem we've got is that our manufacturing as a percentage of GDP has tumbled. In 1970, it was still about 32%. It's now barely 10%. And what's happened is that all the industry which is really price sensitive has been wiped out. What we're left with is industry which is not price sensitive, like arms and pharmaceuticals and aerospace, and a few companies, including, I'm sure, the one run by Andrew Cook, which are quite exceptionally well managed. but the 2/3 of British industry as a percentage of GDP has been wiped out. Now, the problems are, first of all, that it's much easier to get productivity increases in manufacturing than it is in services. Secondly, that you get a much better geographical and socio-economic distribution of jobs and opportunities if you've got a reasonable manufacturing sector. But crucially, we need manufacturing goods to pay our way in the world. And at the moment, we are a long, long way from paying our way in the world. Actually, if you take into account the surplus we got on services, the situation across the trade balance isn't that bad. We're about £30 billion in the red, or we were until 2013. But you've got to add to that transfers abroad to the European Union, remittances abroad, and aid programs on the one hand. And we used to have a substantial income coming from abroad, which has now disappeared, and that's all gone negative, so the whole deficit in 1972 came to about 72 billion, but it's tracking towards 90 billion in 2015. That's about 6%, running up to 6% of GDP. Now, as a result of that, we're running deeper and deeper into debt, both as a nation and as a government, because actually the government deficit is pretty well the mirror image of the balance of payments deficit. And what growth we've got has been very largely dependent on increases in asset value as a result of ultra-low interest rates, boosting up consumer demand, but with no real strategy for the future in place. Really, we've just got a strategy to get us the other side of the election before you can see the figures all going down the drain. Now, how have we got that? Let me show you a graph, if I can get this thing to work. Whoops. Go back. This is a graph. This is a graph where the red line is our real effective exchange rate. The blue line is the Chinese real effective exchange rate. These figures come straight from IMF publications. Now, you see that China came into the world economy in about 1980, and the Chinese devalued the renminbi by about 75%. You can see that there. Look what we did. We weren't very competitive in the 1970s. We put up the exchange rate by about 60% when we took on monetarism in the early 1980s and late 1970s. Then we bumped along for a bit, then we got into the exchange rate mechanism. Then, in the 2000s, we started selling off British assets wholesale. We sold our football clubs, we sold our energy companies, we sold our ports, we sold our airports, we sold our chocolate factories. Huge, huge volumes of sales, which pushed the exchange rate right up there. And now you see it dropped a little bit but in 2007 to 2009, but now it's going back up again, mainly because, again, sales of assets. Now, what can we do about all this? I think we have to get the exchange rate down to a point where not just high-tech industry and exceptional companies can operate, but where you've got low-tech companies being able to manufacture, at the very least, to produce most of the goods which otherwise we buy from China. And how far down will we have to get the exchange rate to do that? Well, I'll tell you, I spend my life buying and selling consumer products, about £2 million worth a week. We sell to 85 countries in the world, so I know all about what it's like to get goods manufactured everywhere. And I'll tell you that at the moment, we can buy most of the goods we sell for about 2/3 of the price from China that it costs them to get them made in the UK. And unless we begin to close that gap fairly substantially, we're never, ever going to get the exchange rate, the balance of payments back under control. But actually, it isn't that difficult to get the situation back under control if you do get the exchange rate down. I've done a whole load of calculations, which are online if you want to have a look at them all, about what needs to be done. And there's actually only two things that you have to get right to get the trick to work. The first is that you have to get the right sensitivity, price sensitivity, for imports and exports. There's loads of work being done on this by the IMF, by the academic world, and if you remember your economics, it's the Marshall-Lerner condition, which has to be 1. All the figures suggest it's somewhere around about 1.8, 2, maybe even more than that. So those figures are in the right place. The other thing is that the area in the economy where you really get very high returns very quickly is in light manufacturing, and that's the area which we have to get profitable again. The problem at the moment is that nobody invests money in light manufacturing in the UK because it's grossly unprofitable. Incredibly difficult to make any money in injection molding, metal pressing, fabrication, assembly, all the things that I used to be involved with. Now, would the figures then fit together to make the whole thing work? Yes, they do. What you can do is you can get enough extra output to be able to shift the proportion of GDP you spend on investment up from somewhere around about 14% to 24%, which is the world average. You need to stretch the balance of payments a bit to do it, to make all the figures hang together, but it could be made to work. Now, what could we achieve if you got this policy in place? Sorry, I need to move on with these graphs here. This is what I think you could achieve on the numbers that I've, published online as to transform what the British economy is prospected to be over the next few years. I think you could get the growth rate up to 4 or 5% per annum. You could get unemployment down to something like 3%. You could have a significant reduction in both regional and socio-economic inequality. Because you get the balance of payments back under control, you get the government deficit back under control, you could get living standards to go up by 2 or 3% every year, and there'd be very little inflationary price to pay. There would be a bit. Inflation on average, I think, would go up from about 2% per annum to 3% per annum. So there would be that price to pay, but I think that's a price that you could easily afford. Now, let me very briefly, if I've just got time, run through all the objections there are to devaluation, just to tell you why I don't think they wash. First of all, we're told that devaluation causes inflation. I was taught that when I read economics. But actually, if you look at the numbers, I've got them all here if you want to have a look at them, it's not what the figures show. For example, when we devalued in 1992, when we came out of the exchange rate mechanism, we started off with an inflation rate about 6%. 2 years later, it was less than 2%. And there's lots of examples of this happening. Exchange rates can't be changed by governments. Oh, yes, they can. The Japanese have just got the yen down by 1/3. So there's absolutely no reason why we can't do the same sort of thing. And there are 3 steps really you have to take. One is you have to discourage selling off all our assets to foreign interests. The second is you've got to get the Bank of England pulling in the right direction. The third, and the most effective way, if it really comes to the crunch, is you widen the balance of payments out until the markets get the message that the pound has got to come down to where you want it to be. Would there be retaliation? There wasn't any when we came down from $2 in 2007 to $1.50. Well, our share of world trade now is only about 2.5%. And even if we did get some retaliation, it would be relatively easy to fend it off. Devaluation makes us all poorer. Of course, measured in dollars, it must do. But people don't go shopping in dollars, they go in pounds. And if the economy is growing larger, it can't be true that everybody's getting poorer at the same time as well. If you divide the total GDP by the number of people in the population, and the GDP goes up, the standard of living must go up as well. We've tried it before and it doesn't work. Our problem is that we have devalued several times since the war, but it's always been too little, too late. We've had higher inflation in the UK than the world average. We've had higher interest rates too, for that matter, most of the time. And the result of all this is that there's been no alternative to devalue, but we've always done it too little, too late. And finally, we're told that the British economy wouldn't respond. I don't believe that for 1 second. I think on the whole, the British people are very entrepreneurial, and they would certainly be willing. There will certainly be loads of opportunities to run manufacturing plants if we had a much lower exchange rate, and I'm sure those opportunities would be taken up. Now, I'd like to finish on 2 points. One is a serious point and one's a frivolous one. The serious point is that the West is doing incredibly badly. Our rate of growth is dismally low and has been, and the Eurozone is in a mess. America's not doing very well. The East is romping ahead. If we want to keep Western values in place and keep the liberal democracy that's the hallmark of the West, we can't afford to go on running our affairs as badly as we are at the moment. You can already see the whole political situation fragmenting, and there's a real danger this is going to get worse and worse if the economy stagnates for another 5 or 10 years. So there's a big, big picture there. But finally, it is very difficult to persuade you and everybody else that what we really need to do is to take a step which actually goes right against what most people are taught to believe. So I want to finish up with a story, and you can judge from this story where you think I fit into it. It's a transcript of an actual radio conversation between a US naval ship, Canadian authorities off the coast of Newfoundland in October 1995. Americans, please divert your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. Canadians, recommend you divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid a collision. Americans, this is the captain of a US Navy ship. I say again, divert your course. Canadians, no. I say again, you divert your course. Americans, this is the aircraft carrier USS Lincoln, the second largest ship in the United States Atlantic Fleet. We are accompanied by 3 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and numerous support vessels. I demand that you change your course 15 degrees north, that is 15 degrees north, or countermeasures will be undertaken to ensure the safety of this ship. Canadians, this is a lighthouse, your call. So there we are.
Right. John, thank you very much. Bravo. And well within time too, which means that we're moving along, creating more space for discussion later. So now I'd like to ask Andrew Cook to come and reply to the motion. Andrew, the controller is over there.
Sorry,
yeah.
Not working very well.
Okay. History has proven that this quick fix of devaluation never works. It is said that Einstein defined idiocy as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. He could have been referring specifically to the tool of devaluation to improve a country's economic performance. Devaluing a currency is the same as debasing a coinage without defacing it. It's been a popular device for millennia. Emperors and kings who were hard up, free spending, or lazy, or all three, would cut a piece of silver or gold off the edge of a coin without actually defacing it in an attempt to pass it off as being of the same value as its unclipped version would have been, and buy the same goods for less. It never worked. Rapidly, people realized that they were actually getting less gold and silver than they thought they were, so they supplied less goods or services for it. The myth, however, persisted. And before I go on with how the myth persisted, I'll just tell you one horrific occasion when the Carthaginians attempted to pay their mercenary bowmen in gilt rather than gold. It looked like a gold coin, but the suspicious bowman scraped the surface and found it was lead underneath. Carthage barely survived, and the city was almost destroyed completely. It took the Romans to finish the job off. Inflation has been a natural consequence of currency debasement since it was ever first started. With the possible exception of Weimar Germany, it hasn't had such extreme results as it did in terms of violence and mayhem as it did with Carthage. But it has had extreme results from a financial and economic sense, and they have been universally negative. I'm 65 years old, and I've been running a steel company for 40 years. I've seen it all happen. My political memory goes back 50 years. I remember the 1964 election, and I remember the 1967 devaluation. Let me show you what happened. In 1967, Britain was part of a thing called the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates with all the major currencies linked at a fixed value to the US dollar, which was itself linked to gold at the fixed price of $35 an ounce. In order to maintain that exchange rate, you had to be able to pay your way, because it meant that if somebody came to you with a pound and say, I want dollars, you had to give them $2.8 for it. Britain, then as now, ran a trade deficit. It hadn't got enough dollars to buy pounds at 2.8. A crisis erupted, and it had to alter unilaterally by Bank of England decree, these being fixed exchange rates, not market fixed ones, it had to devalue by 14%, 2.4. The Prime Minister of the time, Harold Wilson, went on television to reassure the British people that the pound in their pockets was still worth 20 shillings. This is before decimal currency, but 20 shillings was the 100 pence of the time. But it wasn't. It was worth 14% less, because everything that Britain bought in dollars cost 14% more. Oil, plastics, raw materials, iron ore, petrol went up 14%. Virtually everything else went up 14%. What actually happened? Did our exports of dollar goods or exports of any goods at all, manufactured goods, go up? Well, they did. Over 5 years, they went up by 8%. That's not very much, when over 5 years inflation went up by 38%. These are the facts. Let me move on to the next one. In 1973, a long sterling crisis set in. It lasted about 6 years. It lasted from 1973 to 1979. Here is the graph. By now, the Bretton Woods system of exchange rates had been abandoned because the United States could no longer afford to maintain its own link to gold at $35 an ounce or anything. The cost of the Vietnam War was so enormous, and the collapsing, or not so much collapsing, but major faults in its own economy were so severe that Bretton Woods was abandoned. And all exchange rates were left free to be set freely by markets, buying and selling currencies. So whatever the exchange rate was, it was a result of supply and demand. That alone was not sufficient to send sterling into a free fall. Firstly, the Conservative government of 1973 abolished something called the sterling area, which was a very large area of former colonies and Commonwealth countries that linked their currency to sterling or actually used sterling. And this was, if you like, a second dollar block. It was the sterling block, and it inspired confidence in large numbers of Anglophone and Anglophile countries. They abolished it. So suddenly, sterling became a small currency. The second thing that happened in 1974, between 1974 and 1976, the now Labour government gave in to strong trade union demands for wages well above the rate of inflation without any corresponding rate of increase in production. So more pay, a popular cry, more pay for less work. And they gave in again and again and again. And the third thing that happened, which was a direct tool of government policy, was the Bank of England resolutely refused to set interest rates at a level to match inflation. So everybody who was relying on the interest rate, the confidence, and the underlying economy to give them any confidence at all in sterling, which, like all the others, was now what they call a fiat currency, a made money, a piece of paper that is valueless, owing its value solely to the confidence in the issuing authority, the British government, the Bank of England, not to do anything silly, the confidence in the rate of interest to give a real return, and the confidence in the underlying economy to pay its way. All those were lacking, and look what happened here. Look what happened. Over that period, the pound fell 20% against the dollar, but you will notice that I've now introduced the Deutschmark into my comparisons, again, down which against it went 40%. The Deutschmark was the rising star of the time. The reasons are quite clear up there, and the result after 5 years, over a 5-year period, was that manufacturing actually dropped 12.5%, dropped, yet inflation and I think it was actually more than that, but the official figure for inflation over that period was it went up 88%. Well, still, Britain laboured on, a declining manufacturing sector, going down year after year, despite massive devaluations, which had over this period from 1967 to 1979, roughly halved the value of the pound in international terms, and at the same time halved the value of the pound in domestic terms as well. What happens next? What happens next? Well, something else happened in 1992. And note this well, as has been mentioned by Mr. Mills and the chairman, what are the tools for inducing a devaluation? Have we still got them? You've seen, undermining confidence in your own currency is a very good tool. Having an economy which doesn't work very well is another very good tool. Having interest rates that are lower than the rate of inflation is another very good tool. But we tried another thing, the other way around this time. In 1992, a new sort of Bretton Woods came into being, or just before that actually, called the exchange rate mechanism. We had the Conservative government back in again, and they decided that they wanted to be in this thing, which meant you had to maintain a fixed exchange rate against the other currencies that were in the exchange rate mechanism, of which the leading one was the Deutschmark. Well, by putting interest rates higher than inflation, to give a much higher than inflation, to give a very strong real return, they maintained a rate of exchange that was uncompetitive, that was crucifying industry and also crucifying the economy generally. Although inflation itself was relatively low by the standards of the previous decades, the economy was suffering because of an artificially high exchange rate. The world saw this. The world could see that Britain could not possibly sustain this because, unlike Germany, it did not have a balance of payment surplus. It did not have a balanced and strong manufacturing economy. It was reliant solely on giving an excessively high return on its paper money to support that currency exchange rate. Speculators, notably a chap called George Soros, stalked the Bank of England and basically sold more pounds than the Bank of England had money to buy. That is to say, sold more pounds for dollars, for D-marks, than the Bank of England had dollars and D-marks to buy them with. So sterling collapsed in a day called White Wednesday. It's various colours that you can apply to that particular Wednesday, depending on your point of view. What happened after that? Well, manufacturing did go up over the next 5 years by about 9%. But inflation went up by 14%. So what are we doing this for? What are we doing this for? Now, I've mentioned the Deutschmark. Now, Germany is probably the most successful manufacturing company in the world, certainly in the developed world, which I don't include China yet as the developed world. The Deutschmark, over this period of time that I've been covering, went from a rate of exchange of 11 to the pound sterling in 1967 when I started, to 2.1 to the pound sterling in 2012, and that exchange rate was about what it was after the 1992 White Wednesday. Since then, it's been about the same. Now, you may say, what am I talking about, the Deutschmark in 2012? That is the Deutschmark equivalent to the present euro rate, because the Deutschmark basically evolved from the euro, and what was the Deutschmark is now the euro, to all intents and purposes. Sorry, I think I've just bonked something. Excuse me. We're still on the right one, aren't we? So, okay, now, over that period of time, the Deutschmark has appreciated fivefold against sterling. But Germany's exports of manufactured goods went up 61 times over that period, despite a currency appreciating 5 times against sterling. Britain's export of manufacturing goods went up a paltry 12 times over, what, 25 years? This isn't, 35 years. I forget how old I am. So let me just go on one more side. I haven't got very much time left. We say devaluation would revive British manufacturing industry. What is there to revive here are the things we don't make anymore, or if we do, we don't make very much. Machine tools, specialist machinery like printing machines, bottling plants, coating machines, a plethora of machinery. Domestic hardware, stuff that you have on your kitchen worktop. Shoes, would you believe we don't hardly make any shoes? Electronic scientific equipment, power generation machinery, generating electricity, ceramics, tiles, things like that. Trains, we do assemble some trains in Derby, but we don't really make them. Commercial vehicles, lorries, vans, they're not made in this country any longer. What do you expect to do or do you expect them to suddenly grow up out of the ground if you devalue sterling? I will conclude as quickly as I can. Is that the end of my slide? No, there was another one. Sorry about that. There is another way, but it's not Mr. Mills's way. This government in this country has been woefully negligent in supporting the British manufacturers, not by grants, but by spending the tax money on goods that are still made in this country. There are two particular examples which I draw to your attention. I said a moment ago there is a train assembly plant in Derby called Bombardier, yet the new Thameslink trains, and don't forget, there are something like 700 million pounds, I think, a month in subsidy go into our railway system, one way or another. The new Thameslink trains have been made by Siemens in Germany. The replacement for the high-speed trains, which are now nearly 40 years old, are being made by Hitachi of Japan. Why is the taxpayers' money not being made on trains made at Derby, England? You won't find that in France, you won't find that in Germany. Bank lending. Try borrow any money these days from a bank to support and invest in your manufacturing business. You can't do it. Banks have had it. They might as well not exist, even though we have a very large state-owned bank called the Royal Bank of Scotland. The third thing is that when you do spend that money, if you've got that money and you can't borrow it, so you actually have to use your own money, you don't even get tax relief on the spending. So whatever you spend comes out of your after-tax profits. So I conclude. The Germans did it another way. Unlike the British in 1967, when the manufacturing workforce, if they had worked 14% harder, and if the designers had worked better on, for example, designing cars, machine tools, and all those sorts of things, we would have emulated them. As it is, the Germans did do this in 1992 when there was German unification at a ridiculous exchange rate of 1 East mark to 1 West mark when it should have been 4. The German economy, the German labor unions, the German working person worked harder for the same pay for longer hours with fewer benefits in order to compensate for this otherwise highly inflationary, highly damaging event. Devaluation does not work. It only causes inflation. It is a quick fix. It doesn't fix anything. There's nothing short of facing the music and working harder and getting on with the job to revive your economy.
Thank you. And thank you both of you for keeping the time. Now I'm going to ask our two speakers to come and join me here on the bar stools. I'll sit on the far end. You two gentlemen come here. And what we're going to do is to, first of all, have our two protagonists. All right, I'll sit in the middle. Why not? Ah, are they over there? Right, I'm going to ask our two protagonists for 10 minutes or so to interrogate each other. And I'm going to sit here in the middle as sort of the referee. And so as John Mills started off, I'm going to give him the first question to Andrew Cook, and I'll hope to be able to get in 4 or 5 questions in this time span, but we'll see what they have to say. So, John, you start.
Well, I must say, I thought that quite a lot of Andrew's presentation, if I may say, call it Andrew, rather backed up the case I've been putting to you. If you looked at what happened in 1992 when we came out of the exchange rate mechanism, manufacturing went up. and inflation, I think, went up by 14% over 5 years, but that's a pretty low average rate of inflation. If you compare that with what happened on some of the other periods, then clearly the situation was worse, but that's largely because the rate of inflation in the UK was so much higher than it was elsewhere. So what I'd like really to ask Andrew is, why does he think after the devaluation in 1992, inflation didn't go up the way he says that it will do if you devalue the pound? And why does he think manufacturing went up then rather than going down as it did in all the other periods when the exchange rate was higher?
Andrew.
Well, firstly, manufacturing went up, but not by very much. Secondly, on that occasion, the pound was seriously overvalued, and that overvaluation had been achieved by government policy of stalking the D-mark and deliberately overvaluing sterling. Sterling presently is not overvalued. The sterling exchange rate is set by market forces, and essentially the present rate is the rate that the world at large will pay for pounds. So the two situations are different.
Okay, right. It's your turn now, Andrew. You can ask a question of John or make an observation on what he had to say.
Yes, in view of the lessons of history, which prove, as far as I can see, beyond doubt, that debasing your currency, devaluing it, doesn't encourage economic growth and a buoyant economy, and in view of the fact that the Germans have proved the exact opposite, why do you believe it would work in the future?
Well, if you look at all the academic work that's been done on the elasticities of demand for import and export, and you look at all the academic work, the work that was being done by the International Monetary Fund, they published a report in 2010 which set out details of all the various surveys that they carried out. This was a meta-study, so it was putting together lots and lots of work that had been done by other people. What this showed was that the combined elasticity of imports and exports, I'm sorry if it sounds a bit technical, but I guess a lot of you here are economists, was way more than one, which is the Marshall-Lerner condition which needs to be fulfilled for a devaluation to improve the trade balance. The IMF figure was about 3. I think actually that's too high. I think it's probably somewhere around about 2 at the moment, judging by what happened in between 2007 and 2009, the changes that took place there. It is, by any calculation, way, way more than 1. And as long as it is more than 1, you must improve your trading position and the rate of growth of the economy, and indeed the proportion of GDP that goes from manufacturing if you devalue. That is just the fact.
Okay, right. You have another question to Andrew, John.
I mean, you said in your presentation that there were loads of things that we are not producing, and you produced a long list of them, and I agree with that. And I would add masses of other products as well. If you go to Asda or Toys R Us or anywhere else, you'll see loads and loads of products that are all made in China. So it's not just machine tools and things which we're not making anymore, it's all these consumer products as well. I mean, and I just don't believe you can balance our payments if you've got all this vast amounts of imports coming in, we're not manufacturing any of it ourselves. Why does Andrew think it's impossible for Britain to manufacture these goods if the exchange rate is, as competitive as he says it is?
Right.
Well,
Andrew.
firstly, the economic argument, and that's as follows. All your raw materials are going to be, on the basis of your figure of 30%, they're all going to be 30% more expensive. Yeah. A lot of these low-grade or low-tech goods are very much materials-based when it comes to cost. They have a high material content relative to their total value. They also require considerable capital investment to build factories to make them. Now, I've already said that the money for investing in factories is very difficult to borrow because, and there's a good reason here, let's assume it was not difficult to borrow, or let's assume you have vast amounts of capital accumulated that you don't need to borrow any money. Are you seriously going to invest this in a factory to make plastic toys, let's say, importing expensive raw materials, which are now 30% more expensive, to stamp out using your huge German-made presses, plastic toys in competition to the Chinese? Are you going to make any money doing that? Of course you're not.
This is exactly what the Chinese did, and it's what every single developed country's done.
Yes, but the Chinese were willing to work for next to nothing, no money, in a command economy where money itself was a novelty, and having something more than just sufficient to eat was luxury. British worker is not going to put up with that.
But this is exactly what's been done by all the economies that have been really successful. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, all these countries had low exchange rates, high levels of investment, very substantial manufacturing sectors, and are still going on doing so. Singapore's an interesting example because we're always told that you need very cheap labour to be competitive in the world. Rates in Singapore, and I know this because I run a company in Singapore, are higher than they are in the UK. The standard of living is higher than it is in the UK. But that doesn't stop them growing at 6% or something per annum, because what they've got is a competitive currency and a high rate of investment, and that's what's carrying them forward, even though their living standards are that high. So I think the argument that you need very low wages to be competitive can't be true.
Well, I know Singapore as well. It has an enviable work ethic. It has zero tax, just to name two characteristics. And it also has an ample reserve of cheap labour from other countries should its own indigenous labour force either be insufficient or not wish to work.
Okay. I didn't even have to encourage them to ask questions of each other towards the end. So there's now the opportunity for questions from the audience. And yes, would you wait for the microphone, please? It's coming in your direction, I hope, pretty soon, so that the millions who will tap into the YouTube of this debate will have the opportunity to hear you. Right, off you go.
Thank you. Paul Beattie, Corpus Christi. I'm unfortunate or fortunate enough not to have any economic education, but perhaps I could ask a purely hypothetical question that may or may not be pertinent. If you were a small country, locked at least for the time being in a currency union with larger, more efficient neighbours, with whom you had free market of goods, services, capital and people, and if those other countries had a lower debt to GDP ratio, but were unwilling to stand behind your bonds, would you have any alternative other than prolonged stagnation and the emigration of the brightest and best of your community? And if you have no alternative, but could devalue, which would you choose? Politically difficult supply-side changes, austerity and reduction in real wages, or the dangers of devaluation?
Right. Andrew, I think the hypothesis is the UK.
Well, in your question, I identified Greece more than I did the UK. Well, I would first examine, economist, examine thyself. Why are we in this position is the first question. Is it because of external forces alone, and it's nothing to do with us, and it's not our fault at all? Are we partly responsible for our own plight? Now, undoubtedly, in the case of Greece, we were very more than partly responsible for our own plight. I think, firstly, you have to heal yourself, and you have to do all the things necessary to make sure your own economy is robust, is absent the sort of Spanish practices or Greek practices and all the other things, wasteful government expenditure, mass tax evasion, etc., etc. Now, if you're still in trouble after that, then maybe you have got to consider, in the case of Greece, leaving the euro. But we're not in the euro. We are our exchange rates are set by the free markets of the world, not by being linked into something at a inflated rate, unlike in 1992, which you saw what happened then.
So that's what gives us the ability to devalue, which is what they don't have.
Well, that's their choice. If you're saying, if I was the Prime Minister of Greece, and I was faced with this politically unpleasant dilemma, I would firstly look at getting my own house in order. But if I then thought, right, well, this is not going to work, then we come out of the euro, yes. But going back to Britain, Britain isn't in the euro. Britain isn't in any fixed exchange rate. The other thing I would make sure is that everybody was working properly. I don't mean working, had a job, I mean productively.
Right. Let's move on to another question, John, and you can elaborate it if you like. Yes.
Hi, Jake Bradley, Corpus Christi. So my question's for you, John. Assuming that you could devalue your currency and it was politically feasible without reducing inflation and increasing your exports, what would prevent tit-for-tat policies? I mean, we can't all run balance of payment surpluses, right? So what if we devalued by, say, 5%, what would stop the Eurozone in turn devaluing by 5%? And if they're if they're responsible for 75% of our trade, then effectively all we've done is made the two of us poorer.
I mean, I think that's a very fair question. I think it depends really on what you think the world, how the world economy ought to be run. And I think, broadly speaking, what you need to do is to have manufacturing in particular spread reasonably easily around the world. I think it's a good idea for there to be more manufacturing in underdeveloped countries because that'll help them with their growth rates to even up the world economy. And so I would expect the proportion of GDP coming from manufacturing in the UK to be less than it was in China or somewhere like that. The calculations I've done, incidentally, show that you need to have manufacturing at round about 15% of GDP rather than 10% to enable you to pay your way in the world. Now, if you have a structure like that, I think you would be able to have the whole world economy growing considerably faster than it is at the moment and far less of the imbalances that we've got, which have caused such an enormous headache. Now, I've told you earlier on what I think we should do to get the pound devalued. But I mean, if it's absolutely clear that our currency is grossly overvalued, honestly, how anybody can look at this graph here, the one I showed you earlier on, and say that the British economy has got an exchange rate that is not overvalued, when you look at what happened to the proportion of manufacturing and all the rest of it, then I think that you ought to be able to try and persuade people that it was not worth their while not running huge balance of payments, surpluses at our expense, and lending us lots of money we're never going to be able to pay back. But if they simply can't be persuaded that we should be allowed to devalue on your own, the steps that we could take that would drive the pound down. And what we need to do is to restrict capital imports, which are very largely the drivers that got the exchange rate as high as it was in the 2000s. You need to have the Bank of England on side with its monetary policy and what it does with buying and selling pounds. And you need to make sure the balance of payments deficit stays large enough to make it quite clear that the pound is not only coming down but staying down. Because if it doesn't stay down, and it's not clear that that's the government's intention, you won't get the amount of investment you need to pull the whole situation round.
Right. Any more questions? Another question from anybody? Yes, there's somebody over here.
A question for John. I'm Bart Lambrecht. Suppose that UK were to decide to devalue the pound, say, by 10%, and the Bank of England would back this up. What would be the effect of this on interest rates and then on households and the wider economy, firms and so on?
Well, I think a devaluation of 10% would be better than nothing. Unfortunately, I don't think 10% would be nearly enough to get the sort of manufacturing that we really need to get back. So it wouldn't be sufficient to get the growth rate up to 4 or 5%, which is, I think, is where it needs to be. But I think that you're certainly better off with the pound 10% lower than it would be 10% higher. Would interest rates need to come up if you devalued by 30%, which I think is... No, you want to get interest rates down as low as possible. Incidentally, also, one of the advantages about devaluation is you can have lower tax rates. I've got a whole lot more calculations I could show you here about what the outcome would be in terms of what proportion of GDP would go through as taxation or government expenditure. And actually, you can get it down very substantially. But also, I mean, insofar as the lower the exchange rate, the more the economy is likely to grow, and therefore the better off living standards or better off people are likely to be in terms of living standards. All the figures show that that's the case.
Okay, right. We've exhausted our time for audience questions. We now move to closing statements, and the first closing statement, of course, comes from the second speaker, and so. Andrew, over to you for 5 minutes closing statement.
The lawyers call it res ipsa loquitur, which means the facts speak for themselves. History has shown that devaluation never works, it only causes inflation. Devaluation now can be illustrated, the futility of it can be illustrated by, for example, the deficit in cars that we have in this country. 15.5% of our manufactured exports are cars, and yet we have a deficit in cars of £1.5 billion a year. And that is because people prefer to buy German cars made in Germany and spend more money on buying them. And why do they prefer that? Because they like them better. So how devaluing the pound against Germany, against the euro, is going to make people buy more German cars, make people buy fewer German cars, I do not understand. I think I've got that wrong, but I think my point is there. The other point I would say is it's no use comparing the sterling exchange rate with the Chinese yen or renminbi over a period of time. Because over that period of time, China has come from being, and I don't mean this insultingly, a peasant economy to a low-grade, vast manufacturing economy where people, instead of working to survive, work for money to survive. The third thing I would say, and this is not in any way a criticism of Mr. Mills, but I am a manufacturer in a very open market of a product which is highly competitive all over the world. I'm the most exchange rate sensitive person in manufacturing that you can really find. I have survived 40 years by innovation, by adjusting my company to the changing remarks and adjusting my company to the various fluctuations in sterling. There were, in 1967, about 27 companies in Sheffield making steel, cutlery, tools that were family owned with over 100 employees. There's now only one, William Cook, my own. You might say, well, what happened to the others? Surely they were thrown out of business by the high value of the pound. They weren't. They just gave up. The Germans didn't give up. The Germans designed stuff and they worked harder and they made better stuff and they can sell it even though it's expensive. The last thing I would say is that an economist quoted, whose name escapes me for the moment, that the next crisis happens when the last person that remembers the previous crisis dies. Well, thank goodness I'm still alive, because I remember these previous crises, and if Mr. Mills has his way, sir, you will plunge this country again into the ruin that it was in 1970.
Right, there we are. So, John, your closing statement.
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that if we had more people like Andrew Cook, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in at the moment. I mean, I can only congratulate him on the enormous achievements he's done with his company and the success he's achieved. But I would remind you of the other 29 companies that he mentioned, which have failed to be managed as well as that and have gone out of business. One of the things that Andrew Cook said was that the exchange rate was just driven by market forces and there's nothing that the state could do about it. I don't believe that is true for a moment. I think one of the major reasons why we had the exchange rate and still have, which is as high as it is because we've had an unbelievable strategy in this country of selling off our assets. Let me just give you some numbers. Between 2000 and 2010, the net sales of portfolio assets to foreign interests in the UK was £615 billion. This isn't direct investment in factories and machines and this sort of thing. This is just buying shares and portfolio assets like bonds and property. £615 billion. The cumulative balance of payments deficit during that period was just under £300 billion. That's why the pound was so strong. Why on earth did we do this? I'll tell you why. Because in 1999, the Monopolies and Merger Commission was abolished. The Monopolies and Merger Commission had a public interest test that had to be fulfilled before any company that could be taken over. It was replaced by the Competition Commission. This was at the time when everybody believed that markets had all the solutions to all the world's problems. The only thing the Competition Commission was concerned about was competition. And this led the British economy to be absolutely open to the world for sale of all our assets. Football clubs, rail franchises, harbours, chocolate factories, the whole works. £615 billion worth. And so the idea that the exchange rate is just simply something which is outside the control of the state is absolute nonsense. If we hadn't had that big change in policy, the exchange rate would have been much lower and the bloodbath of British manufacturing would have been much less. In France, there was a yogurt company, Danone, which the French wouldn't allow to be taken over because they said yogurt. Yogurt was a national treasure and a national interest. I mean, that's how much difference there is between what we did in the UK and what we did elsewhere. Let me just give you very quickly a little tiny course in economics. Andrew Cook is absolutely right in saying that if you had devaluation, the cost of raw materials would go up, and so would machinery if that's what you've got to import. The ONS, the Office for National Statistics, did a survey recently, or did a report, on what proportion of manufacturing costs across the piece were world prices, that is, raw materials and machinery. And it's about a third. That means 2/3 of manufacturing costs are domestically incurred in sterling. This is everything from interest charges to taxi fares to rail fares to audit charges, all denominated in sterling. If you devalue by 30%, let's say, you bring all those costs down by 30%. If 1/3 of your costs are world costs, you finish up with being able to charge the rest of the world in world currency terms 20% less than we are at the moment. Now that's getting fairly close to what seems to me to be the gap between what it costs to get goods made in China at the moment and import them here with all the shipping costs and everything else compared to getting them made in the UK. So that's why you do need a really fairly substantial devaluation to enable manufacturing in this country to recover. So what I would say to you, and in conclusion, is this, that if you think this country is going to be able to get by for the coming period with manufacturing at 10% of GDP, a balance of payments running at £100 billion or something like that per year, running up more and more debt, both nationally and the government debt, then you better leave the pound where it is. But if you want to get the economy rebalanced, so we do have a reasonable amount of manufacturing, so you do begin to close the balance of payments gap, so you do manage to get the government's deficit under control, you begin to get more regional and socio-economic equality, then you need to get the pound down a long way. And if we don't do that, the alternative is going to be, I think, years of stagnation running ahead. If you do get it down, then I think we could get back to something like the conditions we had in the 50s and 60s in the UK, and that's what we ought to do.
Okay, thank you. Do perch on your bar stool over there, John. Now, on the programme, there's some time for Chairman's comments. And what I don't want to do is to be a sort of third wheel on this particular wagon, pretending that I'm part of the debate. But I would like to make a number of observations, really. I think that what has been striking this evening is the way in which we've had two protagonists who have put forward very powerful arguments with respect to the UK being in the wrong place at the moment. On the one hand, we've had John Mills, who has presented essentially a macroeconomics argument, focusing on the exchange rate, and the exchange rate as a means of varying the competitiveness of the economy. Now, as I said in my opening remarks, the exchange rate was used aggressively by some economies in the 1950s and 60s, notably by Italy and by Germany, as a means of sustaining or enhancing the competitiveness of their industry. It was used as a positive variable. In the UK, it's always been an element of failure of policy when the exchange rate has been changed. It's always when there's been some particular crisis. So John has got a point in that we should look, in the position that the UK is at the moment, at the whole range of macroeconomic tools that we might have. And as Andrew pointed out, not being members of the Eurozone, we still have this particular economic tool to consider what role they might play in a package of measures to set the UK on a much better path than it is set at the moment. Andrew focused very strongly on the nature of business. He referred several times to people working hard, to designers designing well, and to managers managing effectively in adapting their companies, as he described as adapting his company, to the changing nature of world markets. And that is undoubtedly an important element in the failure of the UK to really secure large-scale markets overseas today. The products are not well designed, the production processes are not as effective as they might be, and management has not been as agile and as creative as it might be. This global statement doesn't apply to everything. For example, the UK is a remarkable leader in the world of computer games. I mean, one tends to associate this with the Americans, but actually the UK is the leading country in the world. And there are other sectors in which we lead the world. But it's very disturbing, for example, today, to hear that Rolls-Royce engineering are now laying off a significant proportion of their labor force. One of the companies we would feel is a world leader. But he focused very strongly on running the business, ensuring that you are designing products effectively, being agile, and growing productivity in a way which maintains competitiveness. So here we have two different components, if you like, of a strategy to set the UK on a different path. And the interesting point is to really think about whether they're really incompatible. Are they incompatible? Yes, if devaluation is seen as a panacea and there is no change in industrial practice, then it won't work. Perhaps even if we try to increase investment and productivity and effective management, that things have got so bad, all those industries that Andrew pointed out have disappeared, then we would find that without the boost to competitiveness of a lower exchange rate, if that were possible, then the effective management wouldn't be enough to turn issues around. So what you've seen here this evening, and I think it's been a real education for everybody, is two successful business people coming at the particular issue from two different dimensions. And I think we can distill from what they had to say some really creative ideas about what could be done to change the particular trajectory of Britain. And it could be done. I think all we need is to be positive and to be a bit can-do and to think of how the industrial strategy, the role of business people, roles of taxation and of finance and of macroeconomics fit together. So that's my sort of chairman's final remarks. Both of them probably disagree with what I've said. Now, you, however, have the chance to vote. Not on me, I'm glad to say, but on them. So you now can grasp your little devices. I hope it is absolutely clear how you vote on these devices. Is it? Is it clear and obvious how it's done? Sorry? Oh, aha. Right, here we go. If you're going to vote for the motion that the devaluation of sterling can revive the growth of the British economy, press A now. You're going to see the results in a minute. If you're going to vote against the motion that you think that devaluation is not the way to go to revive the British economy, press B now. Now, everybody voted. For, press A. Against devaluation, press B. Right? Okay. There we have the result. A, 21%, B, 79%. So in this particular debate, Andrew Cook is the winner. Whether this would be the winning strategy for the UK or for other economies is up to you to decide. But what we have to do, you have one further responsibility now, which is to thank our speakers for coming along this evening and for the stimulating discussion which they have presented for us. Thank you very much. Thank you all.